Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our very last event of 2020. And today we have the pleasure of having Elaine Kidd with us tonight. So Elaine, welcome and thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. It's nice to see so many people and quite a few that I know. It's lovely.
Great. So just to have everybody, place everybody in context, I'm going to read your short biography and then we can kick off. So British director, producer, performance coach, and educator, Elaine Kidd became head of the Jetty Parker Young Artists Program during the 2017 and 18 season. For the Royal Opera House, she has revived productions including Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, Händel and Gretel, La Fille du Régiment, Yevgeny Onegin, L'Or Espagnol, and Gianni Schicchi, and has been associate director for Boris Godunov and La Bohème. In the 2017-18 season, she was revival director for Lady Macbeth of Sensk. Elaine studied modern languages at Oxford University and trained in movement and devising. She worked as a theatre director before moving into opera, and as head of staff directors for the Royal Opera House between 2007 and 2010. She worked alongside Richard Jones, Lauren Pelly, and Graham Big, among others, and revived Royal Opera productions overseas, including Don Carlo in Oslo, Boris Godunov in Berlin, Lady Macbeth for La Scala, La Fille du Régiment in Barcelona, and Manon in Tokyo. She was Director of Artistic Planning for Scottish Opera between 2011 and 2016, advising on repertory, casting, and scheduling. She has been more than 20 years of experience of fostering young artists and igniting a passion for opera through many community and education projects, and works in conservatoires, summer schools, and for training organizations such as the National Opera Studio. So thank you very much, Elaine, and welcome.
Cool. It's lovely to see you all. I noticed the preponderance of women over men. So well done, women, and men, keep up. The future is definitely female, I think. Although the men, it's very lovely to see you. You're very welcome. So yeah, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the challenges for us in opera, but for the Netflix generation. You know, we are not in the place that we were as a sector when I became a director of opera. Things have moved on a lot, and I'm not so sure that opera has moved on as much as the rest of the world. And before we go anywhere, can I just see, I know I can't see everybody's faces or anything, but it would just great to see a show of hands of who actually works in opera or wants to work in opera. If you can just put a hand up. Okay, so that's a preponderance of people who are vocational rather than just an interested audience member. If there's anybody here who is only an audience member, can you flash a thumb up? No, interesting. So we're all in it together, making it rather than watching it. That in itself, I think, is a challenge. You know, this is a student opera society, and you would hope that some people might come because they're generally interested as a spectator, but it would seem not. And I think we're very much a bit of an echo chamber in our world. Those of us who do it are very passionate about what we do. However, are we reaching enough people with what we do? So what I mean by the challenges of opera for the Netflix generation is, you know, first of all, why leave the house? You can turn on your telly, you have super amounts of choice, and you can really hone in on your own special interests in the comfort of your own home with a takeaway. You can get up and down as many times as you like. You can drink whatever you want. You won't be charged overpriced prices for whatever you consume, because you can choose where to get it from, including your local co-op, which is not the same as coming into an opera house or going into a West End theatre, where sometimes if you add the drinks and a programme and an ice cream to your bill, it doubles. So why do we leave the house? It curtails our freedoms. If we're in the opera house, we're often asked to sit in a row where anybody who's sitting right, left, in front or behind us could at any moment tell us to shush because we're breathing too loudly, or heaven forbid, coughing. And in order to get in and out, we have to disturb people. And it's quite a laborious interaction, or can be, particularly now that we're less used to it. However, you know, it is an experience, and it's something to sit with lots and lots of other people experiencing something together. But increasingly, the Netflix generation wants to experience something together with people from their tribe. And you often find that the people who go to opera are by that. Are older rather than younger, and that may not feel like your tribe as you're sitting there watching something with them, and you may not feel that you're all reacting in the same way, and that might be something that you want to experience, being with like-minded people enjoying something in a similar way. Netflix, it tends to be an iterative process to get something onto international television screens. So a lot of money is invested in getting it right. Opera at the moment, if you're looking at the best singers, they're actually the ones who tend to rehearse the least. The people who are on the international circuit will dip out of a rehearsal period in week 2 because they've got a concert in Barcelona, and they may or may not come back when they said they would. That really disrupts the rehearsal process, and it obviously will lead to less good quality. The question is not, can they sing it? Of course they can sing it. That's why they're being paid top dollar to sing it at, your house, and aren't you lucky to have them? But it again is placing the emphasis on the quality being around the music and not around anything else in the process, which is exactly the opposite for Netflix. If you're watching something on Netflix, music is a very strong element, increasingly so, but every element is strong. There is no stone left unturned because it's also a commercial activity, and it doesn't have to be subsidized, and it has to rake in top dollar, and it does that by taking every element seriously. So we in opera have got a long way to go to catch up with that. One of the biggest problems we face is the preponderance of singing teachers as the arbiters of what opera is. If you're serious about going into the profession, the closest relationship you will probably have is with a singing teacher or a coach who's particularly focused on your singing and getting the dots right and all the markings in the music. That's crucial. It's absolutely essential, and it's the fundament to doing what the composer wanted. But it's not the only thing that an audience member wants. And until we learn that equal weight needs to be given in training to acting and movement and general thinking, very often, the answer to the question, why are you singing that piece, is because my singing teacher said it would suit me. Frankly, I don't want to hear it, if that's your answer. It's not a good enough reason. Yeah, your singing teacher can suggest something in the way that a friend can suggest you read a book. But once you've read the book, I want to know why you liked it and why you stuck with that book. And when you start learning a piece, it's very onerous. So, have an affinity with it before you bother. Don't let it just be something that happens to sit with your voice type. Because really, frankly, me as an audience, why would I bother? The opera houses are big buildings. Depending on which one you go to, you might find you're too hot, too cold. You might find you have no leg room. You might find you just don't like being in that large cavernous space where there's so much demarcation between people who have money and people who don't. You may only be able to afford to sit at the back of the amphi, and just the experience of doing that might make you feel, oh, those guys down there have a lot more money than me. And that may not be a thought you particularly want to have when you're coming to watch a theatre experience. If you are a Black person coming into the opera house, you may not see very many people who are also Black. It has historically been a place where the white, middle and upper classes tend to congregate, and you may not see a lot of people who look like you. If you are disabled, you will only be able to sit in certain parts of the house, and you may not get the booking for those seats in time to be able to be even allowed in the door. There are many people who don't experience equality when they go to an opera house. However, when they're on Netflix, they know that what they will see, they can choose to watch stuff which includes people who look like them, is made by creatives who think like them, who have an experience which is like theirs. and a lot of investment has been put into getting it right. So the stories are often told with sensitivity, and if they're not, they are taken to the cleaners by the press, and it's aired very publicly. So there's a lot of investment in telling stories authentically. Unfortunately, the economics of opera means that the same care is not able to be lavished on a production. And as I said, if you're in the highest echelons and your artists are coming and going and not able to give you the full amount of their time that you would hope they'd be contracted for, and that's before they get sick. You know, when you get sick, a lead star gets sick in a main process, everything stops and it's rescheduled. Whereas, you know, everything carries on and it still opens on the opening night, even with an understudy who's even less rehearsed in opera. So again, everything is attacking quality, and it's an economic reality and due to lack of time. So many live resources have to go into producing a piece of theatre, live opera, as you know. So it is expensive, and this is something we cannot get over. You know, even West End musical, which is often much more expensive to go and see, you nonetheless feel that it's worth shelling out 50, 60, 70, 80 quid, because you know that they've rehearsed it within an inch of its life, so that even though they've only got a small chorus and a small number of principals, they will be all singing, all dancing. They'll have worked out the sound really well. It will thrill you from beginning to end, and everyone is super well rehearsed. Sorry, going back to the diversity issue, you know, when you're creating something for television, sometimes it takes a long time to get to the screens, but more often than not, it's a relatively speedy process compared to, say, half our repertoire is decades out of date, if not centuries out of date, and yet we are still doing new productions of things that were written centuries ago. You don't get that so much on Netflix, and so you really do get a strong sense when you turn on your telly of all the world is here, and you do not get that when you go to opera. Dramaturgically, it's really, really fantastic what you see on Netflix, which means that the audience who pitches in to watch it will tend to be able to decode an image really quickly. Images don't last on the screen for very long, but people know exactly who the murderer is as a result of what they've just seen, and who to suspect and why. And if you ask them to decode that, they might say to you, it's the way he rubbed his nose, or it's the editing, the fact that he looked over at that picture for a millisecond, or they might not. But viscerally, they know what's going on because they've been trained to watch that to within an inch of their lives. Unfortunately, viscerally, opera singers, we're constantly giving people the wrong information because we are not spending enough time understanding how our movement across the space is translated to people sitting in the back of the amphitheatre or at the side of the stage. Very often, even for people who are in dress row, front row of the dress circle, can't quite decode what we're doing, because we don't actually know what our movements mean, what our micro movements mean, and what our use of space means. And we may not have had enough time working with our colleagues to even be able to do proximity and distance and tell a story with our own bodily relationships, let alone have the physical skills that an actor might be required to have for particular parts. Because Netflix is so dramaturgically savvy, and we are inheriting pieces which may have been dramaturgically savvy for their times, but they're not now, it's incredibly difficult to compete. I mean, we've all done clunky operas where you can't quite believe that somebody can have the thought processes. They've just discovered that person is their father, and suddenly they're singing in a completely joyful way with no process time whatsoever, because that's how the composer wrote it at the time and it suited the period. And yet we haven't changed the music. We feel that the music is sacrosanct and that we cannot adapt the rhythms, the notes, If you didn't get born to play Cherubino because you don't have the right voice type, you will never play that character, even though that character might suit you down to the ground. Will that change? I suspect it's not very many years away before it does, and we start rewriting roles for different tessitura. So, you may all yet get to play Violetta. It might be transposed for you. How wonderful. But not a lot of people would necessarily agree with me. The role of dramaturg in opera, it's really big on the continent, particularly in Germany. We don't really like dramaturgs in the UK. We don't like experts in something telling us what to do. A director might like to have a dramaturg who's somebody who is their research donkey, but they don't necessarily want to have a dramaturg who expresses to them why their concept doesn't add up. And very often concepts don't add up because the pieces are not necessarily good enough to make them add up and remain dramatically interesting throughout and varied in your use of your set and your telling of the story. So we do need many more well-trained dramaturgs and well-trained directors working in opera. Traditionally, it's been the province of the amateur. You get a job and you learn on the job. Again, it's not the same on the continent, particularly in Germany and Austria, where they take training of opera directors very seriously. Increasingly, we are starting to make some offerings for training people so that when they do turn up, they actually know what the job is and what's expected of them, which, considering they are juggling so many expensive resources, very often the artisans, the crew, the orchestral players, the stage managers, everyone on their show is at the top of their game because they've been honing their craft and working in this field for a lot longer than many of the directors who are suddenly calling the shots have. So it's time that we took seriously the art of everybody around us and made sure that we deliver by really investing in our own skills and not waiting for being on the job to tell us what we lack and where we need to make it up. And then the next problem, obviously, is close-up. Even in large stadiums where people go for the experience of being in a large crowd, you would ask for your money back now if you didn't have a ginormous screen also giving you a close-up so that you can see if the artist has got cellulite or not. You would feel shortchanged if you didn't have that information. Whereas, yes, in opera, we do now use video much, much more. And we often, well, not often, very occasionally, will show close-up of what's going on the stage, or just an aspect of it, but more in a kind of editorial type way to draw your attention to something that the director would like you to pick up on. But on the whole, it's not a close-up experience. Even if you're sitting in the front row behind the conductor at Covent Garden, I'd still need my glasses to follow in any detail what's going on. And that's the very front of the theatre. So the Netflix generation is used to just seeing a face, which has invested so much in learning about their character and in conveying that for the frame of the screen, together with the director and the editor and the lighting designer, etc., that we can read that really, really well. An opera singer and all the team around them have to be able to make something work, both for the front row and the back of the amphi and the side, which in some productions you may not ever get to see more than 50% of the stage because of where you're sitting. And the moment you lean forward to try and see a little bit more, you might get tutted or worse by somebody whose view is compromised by you doing so. So and for a long time, semaphore acting has been required, or even people have been happy with park and bark. Now, those things are long, long, long gone, but I don't honestly think that the majority, maybe the majority is unfair, but I don't honestly think that everyone who is teaching at the highest level in conservatoires, concentrating on music and language, necessarily understand what is now required of a singer beyond musical accuracy, beauty, colour and warmth. That is not the whole profession. That is one aspect. And very often this exhortation of don't move at all, you're too busy, or various other things that we get told by singers in our by teachers in our training is for a particular context, and we don't investigate what the many other contexts there are that we need to take into account when we create a performance. And I think until the balance is recognised in conservatoires and more space is given to the full range of skills that are required by people to tell stories for opera, and for different spaces, we won't really progress in drawing new people to watch this art form. And I also think we need to take into account that it is not the same thing to do a fringe opera or an opera in the round and then direct at large scale for a 2,500, 3,500 seater theatre. There are very different skills involved at both ends of the spectrum and everywhere in between. And until we really investigate context and what it does for the audience's experience, and therefore what skills we need to develop as artists, whether creatives or performers, we're always going to be offering something that's a little bit less than. And opera at the moment cannot afford to be less than. There are still a heap of journalists who don't know a lot about opera and still ask the same questions they did 30 years ago. Why is it so expensive? When we know full well why it's expensive. It's an expensive art form, it's people heavy, but it's also not expensive compared to football and musicals because tickets are subsidized. So this question is incredibly dull, but collectively, we haven't taught journalists not to ask that question. And I guess, you know, you get the journalists you deserve. If we don't pay for our journalism anymore, then we're not going to get sophisticated journalists who ask us more interesting questions. And we're always only going to be ghettoized with specialist journalists. And then the specialist journalists in themselves are a problem. They're a bunch of, on the whole, pale, stale male critics who have seen every single production since they were born in 1902. And they will be comparing what they see to what they saw in 1911 and 1972, vintage year for that kind of opera, and their favourite director who has managed always to make this work, and why is this new director not able to do so is beyond them. And it's constantly reminding you that we are in, we're an artefact in a museum rather than a live performance, which we're allowed to take some risks in our expression and in our storytelling for the majority of the audience and not for the critics who are the brokers of our work and will often stop people coming. One of the shows that I've been most proud of that we've done since I've been at Covent Garden is Handel's Susanna, that our young artist director Isabel Kettle directed last year. It got appalling reviews and it was one of the most exciting times I've had in the theatre. It felt relevant. The set was made from recycled materials and had a climate change theme to it. And the critics took it to pieces saying, oh, why did they have to turn this into a Me Too story? Because it's a story about rape and somebody not being believed by their community and then being put on trial and nearly killed for being completely innocent. And why does that now get called a Me Too story when it's a story that has been going on since time immemorial? And we just told the story as it is. And the critics took offence at that because apparently Handel himself had said that this piece should really be just thought of as a beautiful piece of oratorio. Therefore, that's how we had to treat it. There's a poverty of imagination in responding to our response to pieces. And we have to recognise that we're part of a bigger infrastructure, which at the same time as we're trying to make opera more relevant and exciting and accessible, other people are wanting to put us back in our box. And they often have a larger readership, bigger budgets for reaching people than we do. And the other big problem, as I touched on earlier, is the economics of it. The majority of people who make it possible for us to do any opera at all are philanthropists, to whom we are immensely grateful. But on the whole, those philanthropists are conservative with a small c, often conservative with a large c, and they fund it because they like what we've offered up to now, and they're not always ready for high degrees of risk. And again, everything I'm saying tonight is a sweeping generalization, and there is many more things to be said and many more things going on and room for optimism. But I still think opera has a fundamental image problem that we do not collectively tackle. And I think that's because we're always very time poor. Putting on an opera is very stressful, because you have short periods of time in which to coalesce lots of resources to a high level, or as high a level as you can manage. And the process of creating opera is an intense one, and very, very demanding. And it does require you to go into a little bit of bubble as you do it. And very often the makers are not necessarily the ones who are also the spokespeople on the wider stage for the art form. And their art is brokered by other people, critics, and often actually, you know, the marketing experts within our organizations are not necessarily opera lovers always. They might be great at marketing, but they're thinking more about putting bums on seats than about the longer term building of an audience for something that they personally love and understand inside out. So that's also another problem. So our job as people now making opera is to be really aware of our position as advocates for the art form. And what upsets me about the economics of it is it's so exciting to see lots of people graduate and then create their own companies to do new fringe opera. However, some of those fringe operas are funded by being smaller country house operas again, with a picnic experience, and they're again buying into the fact that this is a genteel entertainment, and that the picnic can be as much a part of it as the art form itself, and that a certain type of person likes to go to that, partly because if you're going to a country house, that already is going to be excluding lots of people who would never think to go to a country house. And again, we're creating the old-fashioned image problem and perpetuating it into the future. And yet that is a viable financial model for people leaving conservatoires wanting to create work. So it feels like never the twain shall meet, and it's a little bit problematic for us. But I understand you have to go where the money is if you want to be paid to perform or create art. But it is a problem. And the other end is if you want to eschew that support, that financial support and that model, and you want to do something much more grungy in a fringe theatre, the chances are that the artists you want to work with won't necessarily be able to afford to come and work with you for very long in those kind of circumstances. And they probably have 6 years plus of student loans to repay, and they need to earn some decent money. So again, you'll be working very time poor, and that means that you might get a fantastic job based on commitment and adrenaline, but you might not always get the best circumstances to show off this art form to its best. But what you do get is you get the flip side of la voce. You know, you may get some good singing, but what you will get is some good all-rounders who can both sing and move and storytell and be committed, and if necessary, help paint props in order to get it ready for the first night. But again, it's I wish the world were not such that that is necessary to invest in your training and then come out and have experiences which are not well paid, which are not rehearsed for very long, but nonetheless exciting, but they do not sustain a career. And yet, that's where the Netflix generation show up to watch the next generation of opera. And that's where their first tastes will probably come, is because they're going to go and see their mate in a fringe opera show when they would not otherwise have thought of going to the opera. Or they're going with their parents anyway, or their godfather, because the next generation above them has always gone to the opera and wants them to get into it and takes them as a treat which they may or may not perceive to be a treat, depending on the choice of opera and production by the godfather. I don't think I've said anything that people aren't aware of. And I also think I've said it in a fairly negative way, as in this is a massive challenge to us. I don't have all the answers, but what I do know is that we need to have much higher aspirations for the work that we do, and that the best place to start with those aspirations is while you are still in training. So to ask while you're in training for the skills that you need and for investment in a full package of skills, and to not accept paying £9,000 a year for anything less, and to work out what can I do study-wise on my own, and where do I need help and support, because there's an awful lot you can do on your own. And when you go into a teaching situation where they're paying for you to have a tutor or an experience with other students, what do you need to get out of that experience that can only be had in that group or with tuition? And how seriously do you take your tuition and then work it through, so that by the time you go into the next session, you're not apologizing for what you haven't done, but you are more than hungry for the next chapter in your tuition, because you've absolutely taken on board everything that was said to you last time. Because I genuinely think that that is the only way we will really make this art form live, and that we will get in the more diverse audiences that need to come to opera for this to have a deserved place in society. Otherwise, frankly, I would take away subsidy from opera. You know, if we're not subsidizing people to go to football matches, we're not subsidizing them to go to musicals, and we're expecting musicals to have a commercial validity, then why aren't we expecting that of opera? Because the majority of people who do come and enjoy the subsidized tickets are not a very broad demographic of the population. If they were, great, subsidize it, let everybody have a piece of this action. But if we are failing consistently to get such a narrow demographic is going into the opera at the moment, that we're basically subsidizing the pastimes of the rich. And it's not acceptable. It's really not acceptable. So even at the junior level, where you can't pay properly and you're not really in control of circumstances due to money, you still need to think about social responsibility when you're putting on a piece of work. Who's going to come? What are the ticket prices? Why? How are you publicizing it? Who would naturally look at your publicity and who's ignoring it? How are you subtly excluding people in an unconscious way? What more can you do? Right, I've said way enough, I think. What I would love is just to put you in some Zoom rooms for a moment, Stefano, if that's okay. 2 or 3 people in a room. Mm-hmm. And I'd just like you to reflect in the first instance. I want you to do 2 questions. One is, what drew you to opera? And yeah, how were you lucky enough to find opera? You know, was it parents, peers, good schooling? You know, was there privilege of some kind involved in how you got to opera, or was it something else? And if it was something else, what was that magical thing that got you there? Then just share stories about how much money and time you have invested in it so far, and put a little mental note of when you would expect to be back to ground zero with expenditure. I know that's a really difficult question to ask in the wake of a pandemic, an active ongoing pandemic, but I think it's worth just being aware of. And then the next question is think of the last 2 operas you saw. What was the demographic of the cast and audience? Did it feel like very representative of where you live or work, whatever, of the country as a whole? And do you know the economics of it? Who paid for it? How was that experience subsidized? Very often the answer might be by the artists who, having spent a fortune training, then did this show for nothing or for very little. Or one rich person paid for it all. I don't know. So those are the questions I would love. Oh, yeah, I'll shove the questions in the chat and I'll try and do that more succinctly. And I'll do that. If I put that.
Hi, Elaine. I'm going to bring everybody back. Don't know how to do it. Close all rooms. Here they come.
Welcome back, guys. While we're waiting for the others, can I just ask you what, if anything, surprised you in what you talked about?
I'd say it's kind of surprised me that I was expecting to be one of the only people that kind of got into it at a later age. So in comparison to instrumentalists, I started singing properly at around 15, 16, having gone into it from, you know, brass band music up here in the north and being introduced to it through a new singing teacher. But that seemed to be quite the general consensus, introduced through another genre, which was interesting.
Very interesting. Welcome back, everyone. We haven't got heaps of time, but I would just love to hear from maybe one person in each room with anything that surprised them or shouldn't have surprised them, but did. Natalie? Or were you organising your camera?
Okay, hello.
Hi.
I was not expecting to be on like visible, but here we go. I guess what was surprising that I never really realised is that I think that I might not ever make back the money I've invested into singing with just singing alone. I mean, I've had singing lessons, I mean, not proper ones, but ever since I was 8. I just finished my master's at Academy. I did a degree at university in music. I mean, how am I ever going to get that money back when I'm one of 100,000 sopranos, you know, in the world? It just doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
Well, I didn't mean to depress you, but I do think
I'm not depressed. I mean,
yeah.
We talked
about
it.
It's worth thinking about.
Yeah, we don't do this because we want the money. I mean,
and yet we do have to earn a living, you know, in this world somehow. Thank you. Anyone else? Hannah.
Hiya. We were saying that actually you don't stop investing money into it, because to continue with this art form, even though you've graduated from masters, you have to continue having singing lessons, you have to go to the theatre to get inspiration, you have to invest in acting classes, language classes. It doesn't stop. And I know it's the same for a lot of careers. You have to invest money, but when you can't see the end of the tunnel, it can be quite, well, especially now, it's hard.
Yeah, it really is. It's really tough. So you have all my sympathies, but I think also we have to look at it all with our eyes open. Anyone else? Stephanie.
Hello.
Hi.
Interestingly, 2 out of the 3 people, including myself, were introduced through secondary school, which I think is just so indicative of the fact that early exposure to opera and to classical music is so important. And I know that there are lots of companies that do work around education and especially at that sort of age range. But I think school shows, I've actually done school shows for secondary schools and primary schools, and you feel like an absolute rock star because they just scream and yell and they're really enjoying themselves. So I just found it interesting that obviously that is a great age and it's not unknown. But maybe writing operas specifically for that kind of age range is a way forward, creating stories, because there are only so many operas that we can actually expose safely some of those younger age groups to. You kind of get stuck with things like Hansel and Gretel, or but yeah, it was just a thought that is important.
Yeah, and it's a great thought. I'd actually be so happy if people coming out of uni would go into schools work and get their money that way, rather than setting up country house operas. That would really serve the sector well and hopefully create some good new pieces. Miriam.
I think one thing that surprised me, but maybe shouldn't have, was in our group, all of us had kind of discovered opera through having kind of singing lessons already for maybe a different genre. And that does slightly pose a question of, if the only way we create opera fans is through people who are already intending to be some kind of performer or already training in performance, that's not normal for a lot of genres of performing arts. You shouldn't need to want to work in something or want to be a performer in order to enjoy something.
Yeah. It doesn't bed in the audience, does it? It just creates more and more performers. Helen.
Sorry. I was in the same group as Stephanie, and yeah, do you mind if I share my own story again, which I think I was with Toby and Stephanie, and I had an experience just before lockdown. Actually, I went to see the broadcast of Agrippina at the Met, and it was fantastic. And I went with two of my friends who I'm also at college with, and on the way out, the three of us were stopped by a group of older ladies, and they said, "Oh, we thought you'd walked into the wrong theatre. We didn't think you were here to watch opera."
That's so upsetting. But great that they said it, because the more we hear what's really thought, the more it helps us.
Yeah,
golly.
exactly.
Oh, golly. Thanks for sharing that, Helen. Imogen, final one.
Sorry, we were just talking about how we've, sorry, what am I saying? Got into opera, and whilst we've been at Conservatoire, we've sort of enjoyed opera more and more by being an active participant in opera. Obviously, we'd enjoyed it before when both of us were introduced sort of during school times. However, whilst being an active participant, you sort of appreciate it more, which sort of, I'm sure it's not the case across the board, but it's an interesting thing that we get a lot out of it as an active participant, and then watching something which a lot of observers wouldn't necessarily, who are just wanting to come to see an opera, but they're not necessarily doing the training, they wouldn't necessarily get that view out of it. So yeah,
it's time we started looking after our audience a little bit more, and tried to see it from their eyes, and it's a tough one, because very often our audience are our other peers who are studying with us and also participating. We don't have so much time left, so Fleur, do you want to take questions from people?
Yes, so I think if people have questions and want to get them in the chat, I'll ask a quick one to get going, which is, we've talked a lot, it's kind of the sobering honesty of where we are and what we need to do. For example, training, the awareness of the all-round skill set. I really wanted to ask at the end, when you were talking earlier, about the new directions that opera is taking now in the kind of post-pandemic world, towards the digital, towards the very small scale and the local, and towards the very site-specific, as we stop using opera houses and maybe more outside spaces. Do you see this, as we talk about progress for opera in general, do you see this as a step in terms of, for everyone, a step forwards? Or do you think what we are living in now is more of a tangent, and then we will snap back to a kind of more of a norm later?
I don't think we'll snap back. I think certain institutions like the one I work for needs it to snap back a bit, because otherwise what are all these big houses? And you know, our philanthropists who've carried on supporting us through thick and thin, when we're not producing any work for them, or not very much anyway, want us to go back to that, and will require us to go back to that in order to continue to support us. And all the artists who we got booked for the next 4 or 5 years will want us to go back and do that again. However, I think in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign, we can no longer just put up what we've always put up. You know, we have to be much more rigorous about what titles we choose to do, who we employ to tell those stories. And I used to say, for example, that, you know, watch out, because you're competing with a whole load of very confident people from Oxbridge. And now I'd say the opposite, is the majority of you are now competing with people who've not been let into opera houses before as creators and performers, at least have not, you know, have definitely experienced bias against them. And now, long overdue, there is bias towards them. And if you have got a disability, or if you are Afro-Caribbean heritage, or, you know, you have got a much stronger chance of getting a job with us. And thank goodness for that, because opera itself will be so much richer when we've got many more voices brought to the table telling stories. The stories will be richer, the way we tell them will be richer, the work will be richer. But it means it's a more competitive industry now, much more competitive. And I think we're looking at an increasing quality of fringe work, because the passion to tell stories, nobody sort of takes it for granted anymore. And I think that's a marvelous thing. And I don't think once something major like this has happened that things can go completely backwards. I don't think people will let that happen. So I'm positive for the art. I'm less positive for the economics.
Thank you. Neve, what about your question? Would you like to ask it?
Yes, hello, thank you. This has been absolutely amazing. Quickly, because I know we're running out of time, you talked a bit earlier about ways that marketing can subtly discourage diversity of audiences, and that's something I'm really interested in, wanting to go into that sort of thing. What exactly do you mean by this, in terms of sort of how can marketing do that, and what are some ways that you've tried to solve it, or ways that it can be solved?
Well, we've had lots of conversations about how we're not solving it as rapidly as we would like to. So, for example, if you talk about the Lintree Theatre, which we've only had open for a couple of years, we want to get new audiences in there. So you might have wonderful, very wonderful work that you might equally well see at, say, the Young Vic, but in our space. But the moment, even if you do venture to come into our space because you know it's happening and that's the work you want to see, when you open the programme and there's an advert for Rolex, you immediately feel that you're in the wrong place, and that there's something that you do not belong, and even if you don't actively go, that's why I don't belong, you're reading a programme that is not the same programme as you would be reading if you were going to your local theatre in Nottingham. And we have an elite identity, which a lot of people want us to continue to have. They're super invested in us continuing to provide a niche experience that feels special to them. They don't want it to be more accessible, because part of their joy is that they understand opera. Not everybody does understand opera, but I understand it. And I like to dress up, and I like to be around my tribe who also dress up, know how to behave properly, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of that. And I think one of our biggest challenges is to educate audiences. Personally, I'm one for welcoming people to the theatre. So you don't just assume that everybody knows what to do the moment they arrive and the curtain goes up and it starts and there's a hidden code for how you behave. I personally would be one for you know, the theatre manager that night, welcoming people. I really love, for example, what Stuart Murphy's done at the dress rehearsals at ENO, when he says, and today we've got in this school and that school and the other schools, and let's have a cheer from you. Lovely, makes them feel that they have a right to be there, which they of course do. But you know, getting them loud and cheering, it puts their stake in the ground to owning this place. And he says, and I hope we'll see you creating work for these stages and performing in it. That's just brilliant. Those are the messages we need to take every single opportunity we can to get out there. Because this art form belongs to everybody. And unfortunately, there's only a small sector of the society who have appropriated it. And some of those people have appropriated it and paid for it, which gives them extra rights. And also, they're great as well, because them investing in this art form has meant that there is one. They're actually protected this. So we need to find a way of going forward together by having more conversations and less secret codes.
I think we have time to squeeze one more question in. We're just over, but Izzy, would you like to finish with your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi. So I think about this a lot. I'm involved with NSOS, so thinking about age and thinking about socioeconomic background, is age really the problem if people who are brought up in a particular way or from a particular background can access opera regardless of their age? Does it stem from a more sort of endemic wealth inequality or lack of sort of shared cultural capital?
Yeah, totally. Socioeconomic is the problem, not age. Age has got nothing to do with it. It's what you're exposed to, what you know, what's familiar, what makes you feel as if you belong. And you know, age is one part of what makes you feel as if you belong. But frankly, it's relatively expensive to go to a main opera house. So that's why it'll be older people. And once you've been once and you come back because you like it, you'll keep coming and you'll keep having money because you're older. But there's no reason why you know, a 15-year-old shouldn't love it. And I think we've also got to think more clearly about what people engage with when they come. Too many people say, you know, Carmen's the perfect introduction to opera. And it's like, I don't know that a young feminist would be in love with Carmen as a story necessarily. And they may or may not like the music. The music's got some tunes in it and some of it's quite nice. But frankly, give me Janacek any day or Britain any day. And we constantly think that Janacek and Britain are too difficult to introduce people to as first operas, and that's just plain wrong. They're again, for a film savvy audience who's listening to sound worlds from film all the time, people are used to all sorts of musics, and you know, the idiom of Janacek and Britain, for example, is so much more accessible to a modern audience than some of the things that are deemed accessible. And even Mozart, you know, yeah, I'm not that interested in going to Mozart as a first opera. I think Mozart's actually something to go to when you're a bit more sophisticated. And that Janacek is a bit more gritty. But we haven't got the right people selling the repertoire, and we have historically not had that, because we haven't changed that narrative about how to engage with opera for the first time in decades. But yeah, massive socioeconomic barrier, and that's why I think let's get all of you guys out into schools creating relevant, interesting operas about subjects which are important to 13 and 14-year-olds and below, and singing them really well and with really good dramaturgy and physical investment.
Elaine, I can't think of a better way to finish our program of this year with you and with that final answer. So thank you very much. It has been just a pleasure to just hear you. And I think we've all would like to have you for days and days, just talking about your visions and how we should approach the world. So thank you very much.
Well, I'd love to have had more of a chance to talk to all of you. Can I stay on for a few moments, Stefano, just to see what the other questions were? Because sure. I'm just interested by them. I know I haven't got time to answer them, but I would just like you to leave the Zoom open so I can read them.
So there's a very interesting one by Bethan, which is, what can we as performers do to accelerate diversity in opera? As white performers, turning down certain roles that aren't written for white performances, for instance.
Yeah, I love the way you're thinking, Bethan. I think it's absolutely crucial to understand, are we taking a job from someone else because we've been lucky enough to hear about it, or because we know the director was too lazy to look beyond us? But it does take a huge act of generosity to go, yeah, I could do this and I could really enjoy doing this, but have you thought about casting someone else? And this person might equally well be able to do it. The trouble is there's not a lot of competition at the moment, for example, from Black or disabled singers, because they haven't historically been encouraged at all to come into the profession. When they do, conservatoires can't always handle them, or not everyone in a conservatoire. There's not always great attention paid to the importance of belonging in order for people to then be able to perform at their best and deliver of their best as a student. So I think what we have to do is just know that we do not know what somebody else's experience is. Therefore, be curious, ask questions. When they tell you what their experience is, don't tell them, but you sure it's not because of X that you feel like that? You know, they know how they feel, and they are entitled to feel whatever they feel, and to ask you for help in negotiating a territory that you might be more familiar with. We have to really see everyone as individuals and invest in everyone, and notice who's on the outside of a group. Notice how might we bring them in, because if we're experienced in any way, shape or form at dismantling polarities, which have become such a big thing in our society currently, those are skills we need for opera and for life and to be happy. So let's try and do our best not to polarize. It's tricky. Get curious about why things are as they are. And so, for example, one thing I said recently, which again probably doesn't help you guys, but I got my usual invitation to see something, and my question back was, I'm spending a lot of my evenings seeing opera, and I do not currently need to see people right now because we're not doing any auditions for the programme this year. I will come, however, if are there any Black faces at all on stage, because we have more money to invest in it. We have a budget specifically for diversifying the artists we work with, and the answer was no. And I went, well, then I'm probably not going to come. And until you say that to a conservatoire, they as an institution don't wake up. There are some brilliant people working on this agenda, and working in many different brilliant ways in conservatoires, but actually it's got to be the whole institution that takes it seriously. Similarly, I'm not saying our institution is perfect, far from it, but we are moving more quickly in the direction that we need to go in, and we have to move more quickly and deeply. And it starts with all of our individual curiosity about why is it the way it is, and are there small things that I can do to dismantle that? But the economics of it are a massive problem.
Great, Elaine. Thank you very much for answering that question, because it was, I feel, very necessary.